Michael Upton Zion grew up like most children. As a child, he had a healthy fear of the dark. The peculiar thing about Michael was that his fear of the dark didn't evaporate, or at least get relegated to the dark corners of his mind as he aged. Instead, it intensified. His neurosis multiplied and insidiously entered itself into his life. He wasn't able to sleep with the lights off, and whenever he found himself in darkness, he was reduced to a shrieking, sobbing mess. His parents hoped that this irrational fear would pass with time, but it only seemed to dig in deeper and grow roots in the young boy's mind. His parents became increasingly distraught over their son's plight. They tried to cure him of his fears, but their attempts were met with resistance. They brought the boy to doctors who referred them to psychiatrists. The psychiatrists diagnosed the now teenage Michael with nyctophobia. Pills were prescribed liberally to no effect, and talk therapy uncovered no secret traumas. Michael's fear of the dark was left alone by his parents. He did his best to avoid making his fears known, and his parents did their best not to force situations. With time, this problem became something that was in the background and easily overlooked. It was a closely guarded family secret. Time passed, and Michael led a reasonably fulfilling life. He completed college when he was 22 years old and landed a well-paying job that he neither enjoyed nor hated. He found his mental state smothered in ennui, which he combated with the new things and new experiences. He blamed it on his growing up and becoming an adult, but he could never puzzle out the nervousness he felt. When he was 25, his grandfather died, and being an only child of an only child, he inherited his house. It was in that house, living by himself, that Michael started to lose his mind. His madness started small, like all psychosis. He had the feeling that someone was watching him whenever he was in his home. He chalked it up to living in a small house in a relatively elderly neighborhood. His octogenarian neighborhoods treated him as if he would suddenly start throwing raves and doing that drug that killed a lot of revelers. They watched a lot of news programs dealing with this almost non-existent issue. Michael did not make a lot of friends among his neighbors, and instead chose solitude. When he wasn't working, he was alone. He ate by himself, he slept by himself, and even when people tried to intrude on this solitude, Michael felt like he was alone. A few weeks into living in his new residence, he started to notice that he could never find anything in his house. He would buy and leave light bulbs on the counter after coming home, and he would find them on top of the television. He brought home a pack of steaks to cook, only to find one rotting in a closet a week later. He began to research his family lineages for Alzheimer's. His research found no real influence of it in his immediate family. He eventually decided the stress of his job was toying with his mind. He continued on with his life. When the lights were next to become mischievous, Michael began to feel tinges of panic rising up from the pit of his stomach. He brushed it away as childish fancies that he hadn't been able to bury, but had been able to ignore. He would go to sleep in his bedroom with the lights on and would wake up in the morning with them turned off. He figured that there was some sort of timer function used as an energy saver, but found nothing in his investigations. As part of Michael's ritual, he would turn on every light in his house as soon as he got home. He would start in the kitchen, move to the bedroom, and then the bathroom. Every room he was going to use was lit up. Upon returning to the kitchen, the lights would be out. This didn't happen every day, but occurred with enough frequency to be noted by him. He explained it away as a slipping mind, but knew that something had begun to gnaw away inside him. Michael's anxiousness finally reached a pinnacle when he was reading a magazine in his kitchen, when the room was bathed in a fast flash of light, and then darkness swallowed him whole. He went to the switch, thinking it needed to be flipped, but found it could not be resuscitated. The longer he spent in that darkened room, the greater his unease grew. His hair stood on the back of his neck. His bowels tightened and he felt his testicles retract. He threw himself into the light of the living room and took 15 minutes to slow his breathing. Upon examination the next day, Michael would find the wires severed to the switch. His anxiousness turned into panic. He had the wires repaired, but a week later they would be split again. Electricians were dumbfounded as to the cause. They thought rats were chewing up the wires. The house had its fair share of them, but the pattern was more similar to a cut and not gnawing. Then the lights in the living room would go out of operation. He'd been able to deal with small moments in the dark, but something about this darkness in particular was extremely upsetting. It was suffocating. He felt eyes on him when he was in the dark. He imagined a breath on the back of his neck. He watched a rat scurrying across the floor. He wasn't good at cleaning house and wasn't fazed by creatures crawling around. It passed under the shadow of his chair. A large squeak drew his attention to it. The rat had made it 5 bounds beyond the shadow when it reached the limit of its body. Michael stared at the corpse in horror. 2 of its legs had been torn off, and it was missing half an ear and one of its eyes. Michael spent the rest of the day avoiding shadows. Whatever was in there was the cause of his terror, and it was the presence in the darkness. It had been watching him for a long time. He knew that it had started by toying with him. It moved his things around to play with his mind, and its pranks on the lights was escalating the situation. Michael dry heaved when he noticed that it had probably cut the lights while he was sleeping. It was alone with him while he slept. What did this thing want? He shuddered because a part of him knew exactly what it wanted. Whatever creature did that to the rat had a new target. It wanted Michael. He sought to escape the house, but knew before he had even reached the door that it would be a fruitless struggle. The door was bathed in shadows. Michael could feel it there. It was waiting for him to stick his hand out and grope for the knob so he could pull back a ragged and bloody stump. He knew that it wouldn't kill him. It would maim him. Whatever was in the shadows wanted to take its time with him. It had been playing with him for weeks, and now the game had reached its crescendo. He wouldn't be taken so easily. Something told him that if he could make it to sunrise, that he would be able to escape. The creature hid in the shadows, and if Michael was right, when the sun rose, it would be left with nowhere to hide except wherever it hid during the day. He prayed to God it couldn't walk in the light. He just had to make it until 5 a.m. He had to avoid the dark for just a few hours. The sun was beginning to set, and before that could happen, he'd have to make sure he would be ready to deal with this threat. Michael ran all over the house, trying to collect everything he could use to make it through the night. He knew the lights wouldn't hold out for long, and they'd eventually be cut. He grabbed a lighter, matchboxes, candles, and batteries. He looked out the window as the sun slowly sank beneath the horizon. He had just one last thing he needed before he was ready to confront the darkness. The only problem with that was that it was in the closet in his bedroom. The door swung open, and the light that streamed into the closet was almost instantly consumed by the hungry darkness. There was no light bulb in this place. He had wanted to install a light switch in every single room of this house when he moved in. But then the trouble had all started and he was always sidetracked. The closet was about 6 feet long, and the coincidence of that did not escape Michael. The item he wanted sat on the shelf in the back corner. In the murky darkness, he could just make out the flashlight. He knew he'd have to enter the dark if he wanted to retrieve it. He stepped forward and felt the oppressive darkness begin to circle around him. He pulled out his lighter and struck it. The flame illuminated a radius of around a foot. He walked slowly in that space, afraid that whatever was in the shadows would lunge out at him at any second. His eyes wandered all around him as he edged closer to the flashlight. He grabbed it off the shelf, and when he turned around, he saw the thing in the darkness. It was on the border between the darkness and the light, but Michael saw it clearly enough. Its entire body was jet black, like it had been made of obsidian ink. Its eyes were a dark red that resembled a blood-red ruby, dropped into clouded water. Its body was emaciated. The sight was quick, but burned itself onto his mind. Its sudden appearance caused his finger to slip off the button that was depressing the lighter, and the closet was quickly swallowed in darkness as the flame died. Michael quickly moved his thumb to the striated wheel and spun it while depressing the button that aerosoled the lighter fluid. The spark caught and sent out a flame. He expected the closet to be empty when the light returned, but he was horribly mistaken. The light brought the image of the monster's visage just inches away from his own. The monster skittered back into the shadows with a noise that sounded in between the cry of a child and the shriek of rusty hinges. Its mouth was horrifying in and of itself. It looked like it had been fused shut, but it had chewed through its own sealed lips to form a new mouth. It was a ragged, wet hole that exposed 2 rows of horrendously sharp teeth. Its breath reeked of the sickly sweet smell of decay. He silently prayed to a god he never truly believed in, but would start if he made it through the night alive, that the light would ward off the monster. Michael threw himself out of the closet into the light and threw up by his bed. That thing had been by his bedside while he slept. Michael wiped his mouth and became aware of the sound of wood being sawed. He noticed what was happening a second too late, as the wires that were supplying light to his room were severed by that thing's serrated claws. The room sank into darkness, and the creature slid out into the blackness to join him in the room. He struck the lighter and made his way towards the door with everything he could think of to create light. He opened the door to the hallway and looked back into the darkness one last time just as the pitch-black hand lunged out of the dark and batted at his hand. Michael shrieked as the lighter flew from his grasp and into a corner of his bedroom. The door slammed shut and left him in the hallway and shielded the light in the bedroom with the creature. Michael heard a noisy crunching that he recognized as the monster's teeth chewing into the plastic and spraying the bitter lighter fluid into its mouth. The lighter was gone, but he still had matches to light up the night. The lighter was destroyed, and now he realized that the sun had completely sunk beneath the horizon. He would soon be completely surrounded in the dark that the creature made its home. The kitchen was his best bet for surviving the night. The light bulb in the living room had been flickering, and Michael needed that light for just a few minutes while he set up his defenses. Without it, he imagined himself being rent apart by obsidian-esque claws. He threw himself into the corner by the refrigerator. He swung open the door and pressed his back against it. The light bathed him while he set down candles and began to light them. He heard the door upstairs swing open and knew that the shadow was coming for him. Michael heard the sound of something coming down the stairs. It paused in the living room and heard the sound of plaster being torn and a furious screeching in the wall. It was attacking the wires. It had been in the walls, severing the wires, but now it was able to forego subtlety. The lights shorted out in the living room. The creature was a room away, and he hadn't even lit any of the candles. He had to hurry or he would meet a horrible fate. The man shakily struck a match and lit 2 of the 3 candles with a single stick of phosphorus. The match burned down, and a brief flash of pain licked through his fingers before lighting the 3rd and final candle using the other candle. The room was bathed in darkness with only 4 sources of light to protect Michael from an extremely gruesome end. The 3 candles in the light of the fridge kept the monster at bay. He looked up and could see the creature watching him from the shadows. He almost wasn't able to make it out were it not for the eyes. The dark red rubies poked out from the shadows. The eyes were so intently watching him, and a shiver shook through his body when he noticed that those were the very eyes he felt on him when he was in the shadows. They had been on him ever since he came to this house, and he was only just now becoming acquainted with their owner. The longer those eyes watched him, the more unhinged he became. His fear quickly turned into anger. Fear is a paralytic, and anger is a motivator. It motivated Michael's next decision. Michael decided to needle the beast the way it had been taunting him. He set the head of the phosphorus tip on the strike band of the match, and with his free hand, he flicked it. The match spun through the air and landed lit at the feet of the shadow creature. The creature skittered away with a surprising speed that he wished he hadn't seen. Michael growled, "How does it feel, asshole? Who's spooking who now?" The creature had scurried behind the dividing wall between the living room and the kitchen. Not seeing the creature's self-made bloody maw was worse than seeing it. Images of what it could be doing in the darkness out of his sight were terrifying. It was probably behind the adjoining wall to the fridge, and it deeply unsettled Michael to think that it was only a few feet away from him. What flustered him more was the sound emanating through the wall. A low scratching sound could be heard, like iron nails scratching into plaster. It was very slow and deliberate. The sound continued for a few minutes. It was tunneling through the wall. Michael almost threw himself into the darkness to escape being near the fridge, but managed to control himself. It was certain death to go into the oppressive darkness that now consumed his house. It was trying to surprise him. And 2 could play at that game. He stuffed the matches and flashlight into his pocket. He gathered the 3 candles in his hand and winced at the hot wax dripping down them onto his knuckles. He peeked in between the crevice just in time to see a blackened hand reach through the newly made hole in the wall and unplug the fridge. Michael's hiding place vanished into the dark. The thing looped around the corner, intending to catch its prey unexpected, but instead moved right into the light rays of Michael's candles. It shrieked inhumanly and skittered off into the dark by the stairs near the front door. It enveloped itself in the shadows and looked out to him from safety. He felt an insane drive within himself to push for the door and tried to escape while the creature was in retreat by the stairs. He started forward, but something caught his eye on the alcove by the dividing wall between the kitchen and the living room. A set of blood-red ruby eyes. The creature was lying in wait just a few feet away, hidden by the dividing wall, looking to slip in behind him and catch him unaware. He whirled on it and shoved the candles in its face. The monster shielded its eyes from the light and sank against the wall. Michael triumphantly pushed forward and was horrified at the response. The creature pushed itself back into the shadows and faded into them. It was able to become one with the dark. There was no way he could be able to escape that. Michael retreated into the kitchen and found the thing waiting for him. It was perched on the counter. It had traveled behind him with such speed that Michael almost completely lost hope in that instant. It watched him from the counter, perched like a gargoyle on top of an ancient cathedral. He drove the monster off the counter, only to watch it melt back into the shadows. He sunk against the cooking unit, which was an oven and a stovetop combined. He set the candles around him and took a second to calm himself. His heart jackhammered in his chest, and knew that if he survived this night, he had shaved a few years off of it with the trauma he had undergone. Michael rested his head against the oven door and tried to calm himself. He repeated the mantra to himself over and over. He would either have a complete mental breakdown or a heart attack if he didn't do something. He smiled sardonically when he noticed that maybe a relatively quick heart attack would spare him the horrors he would endure if the thing got to him. I am going to survive. I am going to survive. I am going to survive. He looped the words and repeated them ad nauseum like they would ward off the evil. The mantra helped in slowing his heart down, which had threatened to burst in his chest. His breathing slowed down and returned to a normal rate. He hadn't noticed how much sound he was making with his panicked breaths and repeated mantra until they stopped. As soon as the cacophony of his body had ceased, he became aware of something that spiked his heart rate back up. A faint tapping coming from inside the oven he was resting his head against. Michael turned his head and looked into the eyes of the creature. It was inside the damned oven. It had crammed its body inside it like a jack-in-the-box, and it looked out at him with its hungry, always exposed mouth that either looked like it was smiling or screaming. His bladder released, and he wet himself. A small portion of him recalled he hadn't pissed himself since he was 5 years old. He slapped at the oven knob and turned it on while hysterically shrieking. The creature faded away from the inside of the oven and materialized off in the shadows away from Michael's eyes. It was then that Michael knew the full extent of its powers and despair beset him. It could become one with the shadows, and it could teleport wherever there was darkness. It was shadows. He was surrounded by the shadows. If he had a gun, he would have just put it in his mouth. It didn't even cross his mind to attempt to shoot at the creature. He was that forlorn. He could run anywhere he liked, but the creature would be waiting for him at the end of his journey with his torn open jaws waiting for him. Michael wept then, and knew that the tears would be spilling out onto his pants that were already urine-stained. Michael didn't know how long he wept or when he started to drift off. The last thing he could recall before drifting off was looking up at the clock and seeing that it was 1. He dreamt of darkness and the sound of an old man endlessly muttering prayers that would do him no good. What woke him was something he had never experienced before. He felt something slowly moving through his hair. It started at the forehead and moved to the back of his head. It took him a second to place the sensation. The creature was stroking his head like a parent soothing a sleeping child. Michael looked up into the creature's darkened eyes and snarling maw hanging from the ceiling and screamed. He lowered himself to the kitchen floor just as its hand tightened around a lock of hair and tried to pull him up into the darkness. He drove his feet into the drawers and locked his hands on the oven handle. The monster jerked hard upward, and he screamed in a sharp pain as the creature parted a hank of hair away from his head. The creature pulled the hair into its mouth and faded away into the darkness of the ceiling. Michael's eyes shot around the room, frantically scanning for the fiend. It was now 4 o'clock. The sun was only a few hours away, but he knew that he would never make it. He wasn't sure he would even last another minute. The candles had almost completely melted away, which allowed the shadows to descend upon him. He clicked on the flashlight and waved it around the room. He continued scanning until he got the creature in his sights. He kept the monster in the focus of the flashlight. It gave a shriek and tried to flee the light, but Michael tracked it. Its cries had doubled as it fled the room. A thought dawned on him as he watched it take flight with perverse glee. Was it as scared of the light as he was of the darkness? Was this its attempt to eliminate a monster that sought to bathe its world in light? Screw it either way, Michael thought. He shot across the room, praying that he wouldn't be dragged into the darkness and that it hadn't got to it already. His hand reached the kitchen light switch and he flicked it up. A brief flash encompassed the room, and Michael whirled around just in time to see the monster's pained and shocked expression. It had faded into darkness and moved to sever the wires for the room. He only had a few seconds and he had to enact his plan before the dark swallowed him once again. Michael stuck his head in the oven and blew out the pilot light and turned the gas up to full. He lit the fire on the stove eye just as the room sank into blackness. Michael swung his flashlight wildly around the kitchen as he sprinted for safety. He heard the guttural growl of the fiend as it made its way towards him. He came to the fridge and tore the shelves out. He threw himself in just as a hand raked across his back and tore 4 rivulets into him. He screamed out as pain blossomed in his back. He spun the flashlight one last time and drove the emaciated creature back. He slammed the fridge door shut and waited for the wrath of the gods to descend upon them in a fiery explosion. He sat huddled and cramped in that refrigerator for what felt like a century, while the thing scratched and pulled at the door that he desperately tried to keep shut. Finally, a deafening explosion rocked the fridge and almost tipped it over. An unearthly shriek pierced the aftershock. Michael waited half an hour before mustering up the courage to step outside into the wreckage that was once his kitchen, goaded by the increasing heat inside the cramped box. The kitchen looked exactly like a bomb had gone off in it. The wall joining with the oven was still burning, and the curtains were smoldering. The room had transformed into a furnace, but he didn't see any signs that the creature had survived the blast. The kitchen was so ravaged that he could barely tell what was anything. It was all charred and black and smoking. The fire alarm was going off, and he could hear the sounds of sirens off in the distance. He'd have a lot of explaining to do to the fire department. Michael looked out the window. His clock was currently melting on the wall like a Salvador Dali painting. He knew that it was morning. He could see the outlines of the sun rising out from behind the mountains. He had survived. Michael felt his body racked as laughter rolled through him like a wave. Tears welled up in his eyes as he batted the giddiness that swallowed him whole. He stopped laughing when he realized that he wasn't the only one who was laughing. Michael felt something completely alien drag itself across the back of his teeth. He knew it was a tongue, and he knew in that moment that this is what it wanted. It wanted all its options limited so it could take its only refuge left. A small part of Michael knew that there had always been a darkness inside himself. He didn't have time to reflect on that, as a popping sound filled the entirety of his body. That popping sound was his lungs tearing apart and his head splitting open as the darkness of what's inside Michael consumed him from the inside out.